Welcome! As we get deeper into the see what we know phase of the scientific method, this is also a good time to pause and reflect on what we know from the process. One theme in this unit is what we need to know what we know. As I mentioned in the recording last week, some of the ideas about types of sources might not be new information to you, but it's helpful to keep it in mind in this context because it influences what we can take away from different types of sources, as we learned about in the information about non-empirical articles. The information about APA style was a little different perspective, but the idea was still related to the idea of what knowledge we can gather from the different types of sources. We can use that knowledge of APA style to guide our reading, so hopefully empirical articles become a little less overwhelming. As you use the related strategies to look for information in articles, it's good to remember that we still need to think about the meaning of the information we find. For example, authors will sometimes refer to a hypothesis in a literature review when they're referring to a theory on which their work is based. That hypothesis is different from their research hypothesis. Once we know the purpose and so forth, we need to know how the authors went about achieving that purpose, or testing the hypothesis. The sections of the worksheet about the population and sample help us understand that, and put the findings in context. As I mentioned in another recording, that context is part of the reason APA style uses language like supports and suggests instead of prove. We're working with people and using statistics to understand general trends, so the findings aren't absolute. There's actually a similar theme represented in the variables and operational definitions section of the worksheet. Understanding how the variables were measured or manipulated helps us know what the article is actually talking about. The formal ideas are related to the concept of validity. One of the reasons I have you include a lot of details here is because we're working on building a resource library for when we design our study. We might want to measure or manipulate a variable that we read about, so having these notes makes it easier to see what our options are for operationalizing that variable. That said, remember that operational definitions fall into one of two categories, manipulated or measured. The measured category can be further divided into observation, self-report, and physiological measures. Each operational definition will only fall into one of those categories. Side note, observational definitions, operationalizations are less common, which might be part of the reason I forgot to even include a note about that on the summary worksheet. If you come across a variable defined with an observation, you'll record information similar to what you find for self-report measures. Noting the research design helps us remember that will influence whether we should be thinking about cause and effect or just things that go together. That said, remember that studies sometimes appear to have manipulated a variable, but they aren't experiments. One of the article options you'll see later this week is about social support and susceptibility to illness. In that study, they manipulated exposure to illness, but exposed everyone to that same level of illness to measure how social support related to whether or not they got sick. One of the other options about posture and stress manipulated posture as part of an experiment, but also manipulated stress so that everyone was stressed out so they could see how posture affects that response. When you get to the results, we're going to focus on what the authors say about the goal or the hypothesis. The other information is important, but it can be overwhelming, as I mentioned in talking about bananas in the recording for that section. The last part of the worksheet is really what we're interested in. The other parts are necessary to get here, but this is the bottom line, literally and figuratively. I word it the way I do about adding to knowledge to encourage you to think about the meaning of the results rather than just paraphrasing them. In the long run, it'll help the ideas come together a little bit easier. So, what is that long run I mentioned? The short answer is the research proposal. Each of the pages, activities, and assignments is intended to simulate part of the process a researcher follows in designing a study, culminating in a proposal for that study. Right now, we're working on the literature review to help us develop a hypothesis, but also making notes that might help with the method. That said, the next step will be to select more articles. Page 411 is designed to give you an idea of the steps involved in identifying articles for a literature review. You'll use the articles from the activity on that page to practice gathering knowledge from more empirical articles.